the woman, the terrorist, the villain, who is also sometimes a man, and a freedom fighter, and a hero. Hey there, everybody. So, this is something I've kind of wanted to do for a while, this sort of thing. I'm going to take a look at Mystique from X-Men and examine her as a queer icon. Now, I want to be clear that this is a case of me applying a queer lens onto her and not so much limiting myself to explicitly queer elements of her character, though we will be touching on those as we go along. This is similar to when I did my trans readings of 5 famous films and how I am applying that lens onto the character, and I am going to be reading queerness into elements of her character that may not be intended to be interpreted that way, but still can be. This is really important with characters that have been around for as long as Mystique, because until relatively recently, you had to just accept characters that could be read as queer, that were coded as queer, because explicit queer representation still isn't in the best place, but was almost non-existent for a very long time. So it's nice to look back at these characters and the ways in which you could read that into them. So here's a couple of bullet points that you should know about Mystique. Mystique was created in 1978 by writer Chris Claremont and artist Dave Cockrum. Now, Cockrum actually did the work first. He drew her just as something that he drew, and Chris Claremont saw the design and said, hey, can I use her? And got clearance from Cockrum, and then she began appearing as a villain in the Ms. Marvel comic, which Claremont was writing at the time. So that was the introduction of the evil shapeshifter that is Mystique, as a villain for Carol Danvers. Now, Mystique would not become associated with the X-Men until a little bit later, and on her way there, she was also the mentor to Rogue. Yes, if you did not know, Rogue was originally a villainous character. Stick a pin in that, we'll come back to her. Now, over the years, Mystique would take on a number of roles as leaders of villainous teams, as leaders of ostensibly heroic teams, as a covert operative ostensibly acting heroically, and often working her own agenda, always in the back of her mind trying to push mutant equality, if not mutant superiority. Before we get too far into this, I want to make something explicitly queer. Mystique, for all the things I am about to say positive about her characterization, is not a good person, especially in the comics. You get into some other depictions, it gets a little grayer, but no, she is an awful person. She does some awful things. So I ain't defending any of that. Just take it as read. So let's talk about actually applying a queer reading to this character. Well, she is effectively a mutant activist. An extremist, one could argue, certainly in tactic, if not ultimate goal. But there's more to it than that. There's her power, that of shapeshifting. Shapeshifting is the kind of deceitful thing that you would often see given to femme fatale female villains who aren't, powered up to punch and deal damage along with the guys. Often they are in some way sneaky or duplicitous. So shapeshifting fits into that, but shapeshifting also fits into a queer reading of the character for a number of reasons. Firstly, if anyone with a non-standard gender identity, so speaking personally, gender fluid, my sense of self doesn't stay put. It moves around. It shifts. My presentation varies, as does hers. And despite the fact that her normal appearance gives her away immediately as a mutant, she has the ability to be undercover. She can pass for human. The way many gay, lesbian, pansexual, bisexual people can, if they choose, pass for straight. And the way many trans people wish to pass as the gender they identify as. Mystique can just do it. That is power fantasy, yet at the same time there's a bittersweetness to that. Because yes, she can pass as these things, but they are not who she is. They're not true to her. Just like a straight, bi, gay, pansexual, asexual person pretending to be heterosexual, they're not being true to themselves. Or if a trans person, either because of circumstance or safety or just lack of support, continues to pass for the gender that they were assigned at birth, even though that's not accurate. But if we're really going to dig into the queer elements of this character, we got to talk about her key relationships. Without even getting into adopted kids, which would include Rogue, again, keep a hold of that pin, we'll come back to it. She has had 4 sons: Nightcrawler, Graydon Creed, Ray's Darkholme, and Charles Xavier II. Now, those latter 2 I'm not really going to deal with, partly because they are more recent additions, and I don't really know a lot about what the deal is with either of them. But let's dig into the other 2 a little bit. Why don't we actually start with Graydon Creed? Because with Graydon Creed, we deal with something that can happen for many queer people, and that is familial rejection. Usually that comes in the form of parents rejecting their children, which is something that X-Men in various incarnations, in terms of be it the movies, the cartoons, the comics, has dealt with. But this deals with something a little bit more specific that isn't talked about as often, but does happen, which is being rejected by your children. It's not talked about as much, but those who come out or transition later in life face the possibility of being rejected by their adult children. Now, to be fair, Mystique did completely abandon him as soon as she realized he was a normal human, not a mutant, so she was not exactly gunning for Mother of the Year. But Graydon took that hatred of his parents, his father was Sabretooth, for the record, and spread it out to all of mutant kind, which again is very indicative oftentimes of how hate can happen. When you have a bad experience with someone who is a member of some kind of minority, if you don't have other positive experiences with that minority to counterbalance that, you can apply the pain caused by that one person across the entire group, which is exactly what Graydon Creed did. Now, there's also Nightcrawler. Now, officially, what did happen is that Mystique is Nightcrawler's mother. He is the offspring of her and a demon called Azazel. That was not the original intent for Nightcrawler's parentage. Originally, what Chris Claremont wanted to do, he never got the chance to do. Now, the reason he didn't get to do what I'm about to tell you, it is difficult to pin down. It may have been officially rejected by the people at Marvel, but he was also moved around which books he was working on, and he might simply have been moved off of X-Men before he had the chance to execute it. It's not 100% clear. But it is clear that what he wanted was for Nightcrawler to still be Mystique's son, but Mystique wasn't going to be his mother. Mystique was going to be his father. And what was supposed to happen, Chris Claremont's original intent, brilliant madman that he is, was to have Nightcrawler be the offspring of Mystique and Destiny. And we need to talk about Destiny. Destiny was a precognitive mutant, and she was very close with Mystique. And during the time that they were both active in the comics, that was not permitted to be shown as explicitly romantic. It was implied heavily, but never explicitly stated as being anything other than a deeply personal friendship. But it was more than that. And Chris Claremont has since confirmed that it was always his intent, that it was going to be more than that, and that his intention was for Mystique to use her shape-shifting abilities to become male, and as a man, impregnate Destiny with Nightcrawler. And while, as I said, unfortunately, that did not get to happen, the romantic and sexual nature of the relationship between Mystique and Destiny has been explicit since 2019, which that year was the 30th anniversary of Destiny's death. She died in 1989 and has not come back to life. We've had flashbacks, which is how we got the confirmation, but she's remained deceased. And I kind of expect that she will continue to be deceased because comics have a severe aversion to people being in happy relationships. But I also want to share one wonderful, beautiful moment that happened between these two characters. And this happened while the character was still alive, and this was overseen by Chris Claremont. There is a scene in which Mystique takes on a masculine presenting form so that she and Destiny can dance together in a public space and not attract attention. She's willing to present however she has to so that the two of them can have that moment together and not have to hide away. Mystique is still hiding in a way, but the two of them are in public, together, showing their affection, sharing this moment. And it is Mystique's ability to shift between appearance and genders that allows that moment to happen. You remember that pin that we went and stuck into the subject of Rogue? Well, why don't we take that out and talk about her real quick? There's a couple of things going on with Rogue. The first is she is effectively the adopted daughter of Mystique and Destiny. That alone already lends itself to a certain amount of queer reading because many queer couples adopt, either by choice or in some cases because it's really the only way they're going to have children. And as far as how they quote-unquote raised her, they brought her up in their worldview and prepared her to fight back at the world outside. Granted, they also taught her to rob and to steal and to be a villain, but again, Mystique, not a good person. And finally, one last note, something that I kind of take amusement from. You may have noticed Rogue back then didn't look like she does now. In fact, she looked borderline androgynous, which to me just feels all the more fitting for someone raised by a queer couple with a very nebulous sense of gender, at least when it comes to Mystique. So that's Mystique's origins, her power, her, I would argue, most important relationship in her life. So now, why don't we take a look at Mystique's queerness through the lens of her political and activist activities? Well, there's a few things that are definitely standouts from this particular angle. Now, obviously, she was introduced flat out as a villain. And as I stated at the front, it should never be forgotten. She is not a good person. However, she is a very active activist for mutants. Some would argue terrorist, but here's some of the stuff that she has done to further the cause of the rights of her people. We have the reformation of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Originally created by Magneto, that group had completely disbanded. She reformed it. She brought it back. Now, some might ask, why would you call it the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants? Something she would later claim was being done in irony, because that's how humans were going to perceive them anyways. Now, when I mentioned that Mystique is actually quite politically savvy, something that a lot of folks who haven't been longtime readers of the character might not realize, she worked for the government for a while. There was a period of time where the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants was under the employ of the U.S. government, renamed Freedom Force. And she went along with that because she saw the political advantage of allying herself with the entity that was, well, had the power to either help or hinder her cause. Now, if we're going to talk queer readings about her actions and motivations, this is the point where I have to bring up that line from X2, when Nightcrawler's talking to her, establishes that she can hide herself completely change her physical appearance and even the voice that she uses. And he asks her, why don't you always hide? Why don't you always look like everyone else? And she gives the perfect response.
Because we shouldn't have to.
Now, broadly speaking, the X-Men movies, especially those first few, leaned much more heavily into the idea of X-Men and mutants as an allegory for queer identities, specifically as opposed to the broader possible interpretations that it could have, which is usually how the comics have done it. And that is very much a queer statement, because most queer people, not all, but most, have the ability to be in the closet. They can pass for straight. They can pass as a gender, either the one that they were born as, or some can even pass as the gender that they transition into. But the thing is, they shouldn't have to hide, even if they can. That's a statement of purpose. That is queer pride and the reason for queer activism in a nutshell. Taking that political savviness and who she aligns herself with in a slightly darker direction, particularly if I'm going to give it a queer reading, there was a period of time in which she was effectively a double agent for Professor Xavier. She did the dirty work that he knew needed to be done, but he could not risk the X-Men doing. He could not risk their images being tainted by what he needed done. And so he got Mystique to do it. Someone who is the much more publicly accepted head of the mutants, so if we extrapolate and say the queer movement, uses her in a way that is to his advantage, but he will not be there to support her. He expects her support of him, but he is not going to reciprocate that. And if I could get dark for a little bit, that feels in many ways reflective of some of the infighting that goes on within the LGBTQ plus community. And if you're outside this community, you might not be aware of it, but it's not a homogenous group. There are people in various stripes of this rainbow that we exist in who take issue with others. And it's not that huge a leap to interpret the acts of Charles Xavier under these circumstances to be along the lines of people who are pushing forward a, say, for instance, homosexual positive platform, but are not prepared to fight for trans rights. But they can still expect trans people to support them because that is adjacent to what trans people hope to accomplish, and they need to see some progress somewhere if they're ever going to have a hope. But they are still going to get left behind in that scenario, and so is Mystique by Charles. Comic books and comic book characters like Mystique have the ability to do so much. They can inspire us, they can terrify us, they can give us something to aspire to or something to avoid ever becoming, but they can also just be ridiculously fun. And if you're looking for a comic that is just flat out fun, maybe you should consider looking at today's sponsor. Renard City is a comic that features wonderfully over-the-top characters, both heroes and villains, taking place in a fun, inventive world, and all with a vibe of a Saturday morning cartoon from the 80s or 90s. Ridiculous, but absolutely shameless about the fact that it is ridiculous. It follows the adventures of Animal Kingdom Girl, or AK Girl, who has a ton of powers and one notable weakness. She inflates like a balloon if she comes into contact with caramel. Yeah, that should give you an idea of the vibe of this thing. Tongue is planted firmly in cheek, and it just runs with that vibe. And if what you're seeing and what I'm telling you seems at all interesting to you, well, you don't even have to pay to read it. Go to RenardCityChronicles.com and you can read issues for free. It is a webcomic. Although, if you do really like it, you can receive physical copies of certain issues as well. so you can support it if you really do like it that much and find out whether or not you like it that much. Go to the site, RenardCityChronicles.com, give it a look, have fun. And I do especially want to thank Rob Turner, a writer for that comic, for his support for quite a while and for sponsoring this video. That'll wrap it up for this one, folks. Now, I would like to do something like this in the future, but I'm not sure who else to cover in this manner off the top of my head. Mystique was top of my list because Mystique was a massive inspiration for me in terms of a character that I read as queer and who thankfully later got confirmed to be. But who are some of your queer icons? Who are the characters from comics, cartoons, TV, movies that you really latched on to for embodying a sense of queerness that spoke to you? Whatever they are, however they spoke to you, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. I do have a Patreon if you are interested in helping me out and keeping this channel going and ensuring that I can eat and things like that. Plus, I've got a whole other bunch of things. There's links to merch and other social media and things like that. And even if you're not up for or able to spend money, just things like liking, sharing, subscribing, hitting that bell, all of those help me out as well. So thank you very much for tuning in. And actually, you don't have to do any of those things. Like, I'd appreciate it. I really would. But end of the day, you're the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.